You were right in 2023 on Bitcoin. I don't know if you got one for Solana next year.
I'm seeing a lot of new crypto users come in, and when historically, they would go to, open a MetaMask and, trade on Uniswap on Ethereum, now they're going to Solana. That flywheel effect can have a longer life than a lot of people expect.
Welcome everybody into another crypto news recap from Coinage. I'm the host of Coinage, Zack, Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studio here with our head writer, Beganski. GM, my friend.
GM, how's it going, everyone?
It's going great for me personally. I hope everyone else joining us, it's going great for you too. To kick off the week, we'll recap, as we always do, all the headlines around Web3, around crypto. I'm going to be having a guest on the show later on who nailed Bitcoin's price target for the year. He said it back in February. Bitcoin was going to hit 44,000 top out there. That's essentially exactly where we are here to wrap up the year. So excited to have Farrell from Fundstrat joining us in about 20 minutes or so. Going to dig into his price calls and what to look ahead to there. But Andre, there's a lot of other things to get into, including the SEC Coinbase drama, including what's still been going on with BONK and Solana and the Saga phone inscriptions. Infecting other chains from Bitcoin, spreading like don't call it a virus. And then we'll get into some of the other stuff as well as a recap of our top crypto projects, battling it out where our bracket is. But let's start with Coinbase and the SEC, because it always kind of steers some of the excitement, and obviously to wrap up the year, I don't know, maybe people are already checked out for the holidays, but not Coinbase, because you had their chief legal officer still tweeting about what they're trying to do. And I haven't checked in a while, but it is kind of still a momentum mover for where crypto goes.
Yeah, no, the latest development in a legal tussle that's gone on for over a year at this point. I mean, Coinbase submitted their application in July of 2022, essentially asking the SEC, like, hey, we need clear rules for this industry in terms of a path toward compliance, something that the SEC has talked about quite a bit, and rules that sort of clarify what's the difference between a digital asset security versus a digital asset commodity. And so the SEC sort of sat on it. The Coinbase sued in April of 2023, essentially asking a judge to sort of compel a response from the SEC. And no court intervention was sort of warranted in that situation because the SEC said they were going to respond. And surprise, they said, no, we don't think new rules are needed for digital asset securities or crypto in general. In a written remark, Gensler sort of said the existing securities regime appropriately governs crypto asset securities, and that's a tune he's been saying for a while, right? But one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight this story is this idea that Grewal in his tweet and also in this filing sort of called it an arbitrary and capricious denial. Now, some people sort of may recognize that language back from when Grayscale sort of won against the SEC earlier this summer, essentially a court of appeals in DC saying like, no, SEC, like you got to go back to the drawing board. You can't just say that market manipulation concerns are enough to sort of keep denying these spot Bitcoin ETF bids, or in the case of Grayscale, sort of converting their trust into something that is more like a sort of like ETF vehicle. So I wonder, is this arbitrary and capricious language that we saw like going to be used moving forward by advocates and judges potentially? I don't know. Yeah,
could be on a t-shirt too, kind of like a crypto rallying cry, if that is the thing, that the SEC's moves are always arbitrary and capricious. If it is continuing to come up, I think we've seen that before, whether it's Warren Buffett calling crypto rat poison squared or now this language. But it is interesting to see. And I think, people talk about the SEC as if it's a monolith all the time and just Gary Gensler. But there are detractors that we've seen. This was there's 5-member commission. So it was a 3-2 vote around saying that it shouldn't propose new rules because it's not unworkable for crypto players like Coinbase to figure it out. But 3-2 is obviously not unanimous. So there are still those 2 detractors. We've had Hester Peirce on the show, colloquially known as Crypto Mom. She's talked about this in terms of it being definitely something that the SEC needs to clarify. So there is at least, people at the SEC, and we've seen this battle for a while, people who probably agree that it is maybe more unworkable than not.
Yeah, sure. And, in written remarks, Hester Pearson and Mark Ueda sort of said that, like, if you were going to pursue this seriously, you would have stuff like public roundtables, concept releases, and requests for comment, essentially engaging in more of a dialogue than the SEC did in terms of saying, no, what we have is good enough. And so, it's one of those things where it's like, this is not necessarily a huge development, but it's part of that larger story in terms of where does the digital assets industry fit into securities laws that have been on the books since 1934. So it'll be interesting to see like what the court ultimately does in this situation and whether it leads to crypto rules.
Yeah, and I think that tug of war, obviously, again, when we think about what they've basically, positioned this as in terms of Coinbase taking the baton, running with it. We've discussed Kraken and all the other crypto companies now also falling in line and saying, look, if they're going to take this fight, then we'll all come together to kind of try and stand up to the SEC. But it is one worth keeping our eyes on just because, those are the ones that matter when it comes to these regulatory updates and rules. And clearly, I think going into next year, all the enthusiasm around the Bitcoin ETF, if that gets approved in early January, what that could mean to some of these other legal cases as well might be interesting to keep an eye on. Elsewhere, though, Andre, we talked about this a little bit last week. We had Solana's head of strategy on the show to chat BONK, to chat Solana, to chat Saga Mobile. We talked about kind of how crazy that surge has been for BONK. And let me just check the old charts here on BONK because it's still holding those weekly gains, still up by about 70% over the week. And really, I mean, so much attention on just a meme coin. Sure, that was one thing. But we also chatted with Austin about what this meme coin means in terms of their strategy for their phone, because people keep buying up this phone just to get the airdrop of BONK because it unlocks millions of BONK tokens, which sounds hilarious and funny on the surface. But beneath it, there's a little bit more going on. I think we have the clip from Austin on our show on Coinage on Friday. Here's what he had to say about meme coins and why they matter.
People often sort of talk about a meme coin as sort of a bad thing, like, oh, it's just a meme coin. And I think that's not really the right way to look at this stuff. Meme coins are proxies for communities. And yes, you can build a community around crypto fundamentals, whatever that truly means. But you can also build a community around something being fun and holding a token and, getting that token widely listed, getting it integrated into tons of applications. And the BONK team was like, hey, we want to include BONK airdrops with every Saga. And it was, I don't know, $4.30 of BONK at that time. And everyone's like, sure, this sounds great. Like, why not? Right? Because the Saga and Solana Labs and Solana Mobile put out Saga, it wasn't something that the foundation really had a role in. But the idea here was to show people that crypto can be fun, that it can be something that's integrated into your daily life, that there can be rewards for having a phone, which is a novel concept.
So look, it is a novel concept. We've talked about maybe what that team has been trying to do with the mobile, with the Saga. And, that's one of the things that I think is worth digging into here because we talk so much about community impact, the effect of launching a meme token. It brings excitement to the community. It's brought dollars now to the community if people are able to sell. But it is a question I think worth posing in terms of what impact it means for Solana, because now you might have people within the Solana community just joining or leaving to trade BONK, to flip BONK. Maybe whether or not they stick around.
I mean, it might not be so profitable right now. If you go and you look at last week, I mean, when BONK was sort of surging at the peak, that sort of 30 million airdrop that each Solana Saga phone had was worth like $985. So, $599 for the phone, $985 for the meme coin. Like, you can do the math.
You'd make money by buying the phone, which happens. I mean, again, we've seen like mobile companies do that. Buy this phone, get money, we'll pay for your plan. Like, there are games always played. Just because it's a meme coin, nothing really new.
Well, it's the BONK allocation based off of prices right now is worth $593. Sorry. So just below that $599 price tag, I can't imagine, a shipment of like 30 Solana Saga phones shows up on your doorstep and you're just ripping through the boxes as fast as possible because you've got to get rid of this. But no, I mean, this is such a fun story. I mean, like, you look at yourself, like, is crypto healing when you see silly stories like that?
Yeah.
But in like a more serious way, I think like Solana with its mobile push, I mean, 20,000 phones. I mean, Apple and Samsung selling billions out there, but possibly enough to sort of almost like germinate a user base.
Well, that's why I was so excited to see. I mean, Anatoly was tweeting about this over the weekend. I got his pulled up, and it was kind of a funny cartoon that he tweeted out, just in terms of what we talked about, right? The goal here in terms of Solana launching their phone was to basically chip away at the idea of the app stores, whether it's Apple's App Store or Google's, Samsung's the Android App Store. And they launched this phone with the idea of maybe we can have a place where developers can build without these 30% charges. But to do that, you need to jumpstart it, to your point. And they sold a good amount, at least not a lot. It was like 5,000. The goal was 50,000. And so this tweet's kind of funny from Toly because it's like, look, we're not there yet, but this is cool to see that there's people who want to buy the phone, whether it's just to get bonk or otherwise. You could potentially finally have seeded, to your point, both sides of this developer and user equation. And maybe that's getting ahead of it. Maybe it is just people coming in here to flip bonk and then they're going to leave and never use the Saga again. And that could very well be the thing. We're going to be chatting about what Solana is doing well, though, in a second later on with Sean Farrell from Fundstrat. But, I think there's a lot here to be excited about, at least when you look at that. And I guess we'll be checking in on whether or not the phone sales continue. They sold out, though, in the U.S. So.
Apparently, yes, they sold out in the U.S. On the topic of unintended consequences, we've got another story that we highlighted today, and that was the fact that Arbitrum went down last week because of Ordinals Inscriptions, people making inscriptions on the network.
Yep.
And it was down for the first time since June, down for an hour and a half. But, I wanted to highlight it because it is sort of those unintended consequences of technical innovation, where people sort of taking Ordinals, which, as for people who aren't familiar, started on Bitcoin earlier this year. It was a solution to bring NFTs to Bitcoin. And Arbitrum, being an EVM chain, being compatible with Ethereum, already has NFTs, already has smart contracts. So from the perspective of efficiency or something like that, maybe not the most sensible thing to do, but interesting to see the effects that Ordinal Inscriptions is having on these different networks. I've got a dashboard, a Dune dashboard that I wanted to highlight. Maybe you can pull that one up, Zack.
Yeah, just looking at it.
And also, this is from Hildobby, the pseudonymous data analyst at the VC firm Dragonfly. If you're not already following him on Twitter, one of the
shout out to him.
Huge shout out.
I just don't. So this is just for people who aren't tracking, because this was news to me, man. In terms of the idea of these networks copying the idea of inscriptions when they already have NFTs, to me is a wild thing. Because why? Because why do this? Because it doesn't make any sense to me. Ordinals existing on Bitcoin made sense because Bitcoin didn't have the ability to make NFTs. And now we saw Arbitrum go down because of this. It seems like the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, well, critics have called it spam. They've called it an attack on Bitcoin. And I really do think that, I've talked to some sources about this before, upwards of 90% of these Ordinals Inscriptions transactions are people minting specifically tokens built on top using inscriptions on these different chains. So for example, we've got Polygon. We had Polygon up there. PRC20 tokens, essentially, that use JSON to create tokens on top. The reason why it can be really intensive on these networks is because when you create one of these tokens, for example, that uses inscriptions, you can set a limit. So let's say 21 million of these PRC20 tokens can be minted. You can set it so that, you can only mint 10 per transaction. So, for months.
It just seems wild to me, man. I don't know why we're doing tokens on top of tokens. And yeah, it seems a little unnecessary.
Well, also, I think there's technical considerations like indexers. The fact of the matter is when you're creating these tokens using JSON text, that who owns what isn't necessarily being kept track of on the blockchain. You need a separate service to keep track of that. But the unintended consequences, the stress tests, the idea that Ordinals is something bigger than Bitcoin itself at this point, I think is super fascinating.
I mean, I guess it's worthy of consideration just in the way that Elon Musk and other people who have looked at this have called out JPEGs, not necessarily you're buying a pointer to the art when you buy an NFT, depending on if it's actually in the chain. I don't know how necessary it is, but I guess at least this would maybe, solve some of those issues around people maybe critiquing what you're really buying is not the art. You're buying a pointer to the art, and anyone can change it at any time. So who knows? Maybe it'll catch on. I still think it's wild to watch.
Moving forward, if I see if I'm looking online or something like that, and I just see transactions spike, absolutely out of nowhere, the first thing I'm going to assume at this point is that somebody's playing with inscriptions on that chain.
I mean, look, we're going to get into it with Sean in a little bit, but looking back on the idea of Ordinals pumping Bitcoin's price, you can't really look at it and say that it did not have a major impact for Bitcoin miners and everything in that ecosystem. Bitcoin outperformed Ethereum this year, and that was one thing that a lot of people probably didn't expect. If Bitcoin's up, usually Ethereum's past it, and so there are considerations in terms of things happening on chain and whether or not that actually improves the underlying fundamentals for all these different chains. So there may be something to it. I'm not going to discount it because you never can discount anything in crypto. But nonetheless, on the other point here, Andre, those are the positives. Maybe if you're an Ordinals fan, on the other side, we're still kind of seeing people, scared about what happened with the Ledger Connect kit, the exploit there, in terms of everyone was freaking out and saying, don't connect to any, Web3 dApp because you could get drained. And it was an exploit with Ledger.
I mean, it was resounding, right?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it doesn't matter what crypto accounts you follow. If you woke up that day, I believe it was Thursday, Friday,
something like that.
You would just be oh my gosh, everybody was don't connect to any dApps, don't make any transactions. And in a anti-fragile sort of environment, what that's built to be, kind of an eye-opening moment for me, where it's who even needs FDIC insurance if you've got an army of influencers telling you, hey, don't make any transactions because you could lose all your money.
It just means you got to stay up to date on everything, though, I guess.
Well, I 610 million taken per Zack XBT, so not a huge
610,000 or million?
Million. 610 million. I might have said 1,000, but per Zack XBT, so not a huge exploit, right? And 44,000 frozen by Tether. I mean, I think the reason why I wanted to highlight this story is because, it was a former Ledger employee that got phished, and it brought Web3 to a halt.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about what can this technology do? What can it enable and stuff? How can Web3 fix human error?
I mean, yeah, it looks like it was 610,000. If it was 610 million, that would be pretty large.
Okay,
but 610,000, to your point, not huge, but still worthy of looking at kind of how much it does come down to user error, and how much it comes down to, I guess, the idea that, again, you got to keep your head on a goddamn swivel, which isn't exactly great for the space. And every time we talk about hacks, obviously, I think it gives some people pause in terms of, is this better than the old system? And, constantly those fears are there, but,
Totally.
I think they're always going to be there. And then the other big piece from it was the idea of freezing Tether, because the exploit addresses and what that means for permission systems. Again, people always are digging back into the idea of Tether potentially, if they keep freezing addresses, is how much is that going to continue? And that to me is a lurking, probably big story for next year, I actually think. But nonetheless.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Tether considerations aside, though, really hammering point the home, a single person, Web3 to a halt, that you have to highlight it in terms of just where we are as a space in terms of development and robustness and security. So, but I think, Ledger came out and was pretty this is what we did. This was our timeline. So the transparency was there.
Yeah.
Still something to keep an eye on moving forward.
Always is. And the other thing to keep an eye on moving forward as we prepare to bring Sean Farrell in for his look ahead to next year and a reflection on him being accurate and calling the prediction correct in Bitcoin hitting 44,000. So I'm excited to get to him in a second. But the other thing to keep an eye on here is our Crypto Project of the Year bracket, Andre, because we are now into round 2 and the idea of which teams are going to take over for the crown, to be crowned Crypto Project of the Year. And at this point, we got Thorchain and Arbitrum on the bracket, which I got up. Cosmos and Akash. We got Avalanche, Polygon, Lens Favor, and Solana. Again, I think it's really hard to pick one of these teams as being the winner. I think there are a few favorites. We're going to be chatting with Avalanche and Polygon on Tuesday, so stay tuned for that. And the vote is open on our snapshot. You can go to coinage.media/vote to pick a winner. And there are also people in our community who have already filled out a bracket and are basically vying for about a quarter of an ETH. So it's been cool to see this all play out. We're going to continue that throughout the rest of the week and into the new year to crown a champion, which I believe is important. And of course, Crypto Project of the Year, Bitcoin's not on here, but it is a high quality topic to dig into. I think we have Sean standing by here. Yes, he is here now. We can turn to Sean Farrell, the head of digital asset strategy over at Fundstrat. And Sean, we were talking about it earlier on in the show because you nailed 44,000 this year, man. I was looking back in February. That was the call you gave us. Congrats to you. First of all, we'll give you the props. Second of all, we'll ask you to look back. And maybe one of those things, the pieces of calling 44,000 that you say was so accurate. Why did we hit it? Where do we go from here? And a tease ahead to tell people that Fundstrat's report will be coming out next year, and we'll have you back on for that. We might have him. Do we have him muted on the eCam side? That could be. Hold on, Sean. We'll just unmute you here. Sure. There we go. We got you now, baby.
Am I live? Am I live?
You're live. You're live,
right,
sir.
cool.
You're on. Thanks for coming back on to Coinage.
Thanks for having me back. The only reason I wanted to get our price target right is so that you would invite me back.
It's a high stakes game we play, Sean. We don't have anyone who's wrong on this show.
Indeed. So I mean, like looking back, heading into this year, I think a lot of people have really focused on the ETF recently, have focused on the halving coming up. But if you look at the macro drivers that really are a buoy to Bitcoin and crypto assets as a whole, we've had a pretty sizable expansion of global liquidity over the past couple of months. And so while it's true that these idiosyncratic factors are certainly helping drive price or remove sellers from the market, there are also macro considerations to apply here. And that's kind of what drove our thesis heading into this year. Global liquidity had bottomed, the worst of tightening was over, the dollar index had peaked. And importantly, everyone that was over leveraged and all the baddies were washed out. So
all the baddies were washed out is a good way to sum up, I think, the year in general. But the other key component that I went back and looked at the interview, which, by the way, it's up on YouTube, probably the easiest way to find it. If you go back to our YouTube page, you'd be able to pull this interview up that I'm looking at now. But the other element that came from it is usually when Bitcoin's up, Ethereum, as you noted in that interview, trades as if it's a beta to Bitcoin. So you would have expected ETH to outperform Bitcoin this year. But Bitcoin was up 140, ETH was up less than that, below 100%, mostly like 80%, I think. So, I mean, when you look at that, what surprises you about it, and how much maybe does Ordinals deserve? We were talking about Ordinals. Is that a big component as to why maybe that happened?
Yeah, I think what in retrospect, what probably happened is that last year, following the merge and following ETH's outperformance against Bitcoin through 2022, ETH kind of became this consensus trade. It became automatic, and without new capital coming in, that just did not manifest that continued outperformance. And I think the new capital coming in was driven by desire to hold Bitcoin. Bitcoin historically has led cycles. There are considerable, proven macro reasons to hold Bitcoin when global liquidity is expanding. And so I think it's probably a combination of, ETH being consensus last year and no new buyers coming in, combined with, the king just making its return at the beginning of a new cycle.
Yeah.
I do think, to comment on Ordinals, I do think that has driven increased interest from crypto natives, perhaps. I'm not sure how much flows that actually drove to the network, but I think it's really cool to watch. I think the whole discussion around fee pressure and censorship is quite fascinating, because if you look back just 12 months ago, everyone's deepest concern was over whether Bitcoin's, would have enough fees to sustain itself and sustain its security budget into the future. And now we're in a position where, miners are printing this, revenue source that they did not see coming. I think we're starting to see that manifest itself in publicly traded mining prices. And really the focus has shifted from, will fees come back to, hey, how do we scale this thing, right? Because ultimately payments aren't meant to be at the base layer. They're
Sure,
meant to
yeah. And well, I think that that's kind of the interesting topic, and we can get into maybe some of the other things. And again, I don't want to steal anything from your annual report, which will be coming out in January for Fundstrat. If you're not paying attention to what Sean and co are doing over there in their analysis, shout out to you guys for what you guys produce, because I think it's some of the top digital asset commentary and predictions I've seen. And again, you were right in 2023, so we're paying attention for 2024. We'll get into maybe some of the other chains, but when it comes to kind of what Bitcoin and its surge can do for the entire space, how does the ETF approval? Right now, it's mostly expected. So, again, getting into expectations versus new money coming in, what are you expecting to see if it does get approved? How big is it in the way that maybe, we could start to see a huge surge in price?
Yeah, so I mean, first off, I think you'd be surprised if you went around and polled casual observers of the space, what their confidence level is of a Bitcoin ETF getting approved. And I think you'd be surprised at how many people are still skeptical of whether the SEC will abide by the court's decision and will actually let them pass. I mean, we are pretty confident, 99% sure that this is going to come, in Q1. In terms of, obviously everyone's question is it a buy the rumor, sell the news type event? Perhaps on a very acute short-term basis, sure, because ultimately you have to wait for those flows to start to come in, and the products won't be launching day one. So I'm sure there's a possibility of that, but I think people are really discounting the amount of incremental flows that will come into Bitcoin from these products, because you're going to have the full weight of the marketing budgets from BlackRock and Grayscale and all of these competitors trying to garner flows and market share, and that's just going to bring in incremental flows that would not have been there in prior cycles.
Yeah, we were also talking about the Coinbase case against the SEC and, what's been going on in that battle. And if, they continue to have to battle with the SEC, it might be some cold water and maybe expectations of what happens next year. I only say that it's widely expected to be approved in early January because Bloomberg's ETF team has basically been saying it's a 90% chance for the better part of the last 2 months. So if you believe them, it seems almost a given. But if you look at maybe what the SEC has been doing in their battle with Coinbase and, kicking the can down the road and maybe clearing up rules for what is a commodity, what is a security, and anything like that, maybe not so clear. So I don't know if that maybe changes your expectations at all.
Yeah, so I don't like to offer opinions on things
what
that
gets
I'm
approved,
not,
what gets not
not an expert in. So like from a legal perspective, the ins and outs of how that's
I mean, nobody can be an expert. That's the thing. No one's an expert on like what Gary wants to do. And when you look at the SEC as a 5-person commission, and it's basically been that 3-2 split for a while now.
Look, if I was a legal expert, I just would have I would have gotten into crypto, but as a bankruptcy lawyer and would be printing handovers.
There's a lot of bankruptcy attorneys that have been printing cash for sure, I think. But no, on the I guess the big question is. We've seen this before, and I think it was part of your research last year, and the idea of, okay, if Bitcoin goes on a run, what does that mean for everything else? And so, I mean, I guess if let's just use that as our base case. And again, don't want to steal anything from your report to come next year, but if we're using that as a base case, what would be, I guess, the right analyst take on how to look at the overall space if all of a sudden Bitcoin sees huge fund inflows, what it does for a spillover effect for the rest of Web3?
Yeah, so I guess just to circle back to your point on Coinbase, because I don't have an official legal take, but I did want to note it is interesting that they recently filed a similar complaint against Kraken in a different jurisdiction. That happened about 3 weeks ago. It was basically a carbon copy of the complaint that they filed against Coinbase. And if we look at that from a strategy perspective, to me, that signals a lack of confidence from the SEC. If they're filing the same complaint in different jurisdictions, that likely means that they're hedging their bets and want to get a mixed result in the courts and eventually defer to a higher court. And so, from a legal perspective, I'm actually quite optimistic about how that's going to turn out for Coinbase. But getting back to your last question on how ETF approval might affect the rest of the space, specifically as it pertains to Coinbase, I think it'll really move the conversation away from Coinbase as a comparable to just other exchanges, and really shine a spotlight on its other lines of business, like its institutional services, custody services, a lot of the Web3 services that it's building out. They're essentially trying to build like a Web3 app store, more or less. And so, we could see some multiple expansion there in addition to increased revenues. And so, we continue to be pretty bullish on Coinbase through, next 12, 18 months.
Out of all of these ETFs, we talk about the custody question that the SEC had in these filings and applications, and almost all of them basically turning to Coinbase was an interesting development in the way that they're going to be using that company to custody what happens if these ETFs gets approved. So definitely for sure worth highlighting. On the flip side, though, I guess when you lean into, Coinbase stock as a way to play the space, there's also the other chains to discuss. And you and I were talking about Solana. I mean, it was up, what is that, a 5Xer, I think, at least here in 2023. I mean, you and I were talking about it potentially, still being there as maybe the new Ethereum option for people who are looking at the space maybe 2-3 years down the road where this could go. And you're saying that you wouldn't rule out a new all-time high when it comes to Solana. And I feel like that's another name that constantly keeps coming up in all these discussions, that if Bitcoin ETF comes along, maybe there's an Ethereum ETF. And then maybe what happens if there's a Solana one? I don't want to look too far ahead, but what's your take on maybe Solana being a way to see a new all-time high? Because that would be pretty huge.
Yeah, I mean, look, our clients have known we've been pretty bullish on Solana despite its troubled recent history. Its association with FTX, and obviously a 95% drawdown doesn't help inspire confidence. But I personally spent a lot of time in and around the ecosystem, and just from a high level, we liked it because it was differentiated. You have the Ethereum, Celestia, the modular strategy to scale, separating consensus, data availability, and execution. And Solana kind of takes the complete different approach, right? They're vertically integrated. The term that everyone likes to use is monolithic. And what this is good for is for developers, right? Because if you want to build an application on Solana, you don't have to, make all of these decisions on settlement, execution, DA. They're all made for you because it's packaged there. So obviously the trade-off being that at times Solana has sacrificed liveliness, which Ethereum, solves for, and that's not good for, emergency level applications, because there are certain functions that you need 100% uptime for. But we saw Solana make a lot of core devs make a lot of improvements to mainnet, predominantly the local fee markets that they introduced. They're also working on 2 more clients, which creates a more robust network as well. And also we thought that people were just obviously hardware costs and decentralization is a big talking point with Solana.
Well, how should people look at it though in terms of like the actual price action? Because I think anytime you got a 5Xer in a year, most people might say, okay, that's too big, too fast. But if you put it in the context as we were looking at that chart back to 2022, I mean, that's still in the $250 range. That would be the new all-time high there. So, I mean, it sounds like if you put all those things together, it's not out of the question, at least in terms of if you have a price target for Solana. As we said, you were right in 2023 on Bitcoin. I don't know if you got one for Solana next year.
Well, it's you'll have to tune in to our outlook on January 17th for that price target. But, I think what happens, and we're seeing this transpire, is that price begets activity, applications, on-chain users, which begets demand, which begets increased DEX volumes and increases in further increases in price. And that flywheel effect can have a longer life than a lot of people expect. And what's interesting is anecdotally, I think I'm seeing a lot of new crypto users come in, and when historically, they would go to, open a MetaMask and, trade on Uniswap on Ethereum.
Yeah.
Now they're going to Solana because it's extremely user friendly. They put UX first, and despite those trade offs and things that they definitely need to work on to move forward and become on par with ETH, and be a mainstay in the top 5 crypto assets.
Yeah.
They created this really interesting entryway for new crypto users, and I think a lot of that is that gives me confidence that there's still certainly upside to Solana.
Yeah, I feel like for you and where you sit, right, in Fundstrat and very serious analysts who are digging through most of the time, Wall Street giants and earnings statements and everything like that. I mean, I don't know how you fit in or what this year's been like, because again, if you're right, you're right. And so it doesn't matter if you're trading BONK, Bitcoin, or stocks, I guess. But I am curious if like the BONK news from this week and that pump and what you've seen there and what they try to do with their phone, as we were chatting earlier, is there anything to highlight there in maybe signaling that Solana's worthy of really a double look here?
Yeah, look, I think there's you make a good point. Oftentimes there is a interesting / tough line to straddle between serious upper echelons of finance and silly memes. And BONK is also straddling that line. But I think it's interesting to note that well, first off, from a market perspective, it does seem like BONK has brought some retail back into the arena, so to speak, because retail loves memes. And then also just BONK from like an asset, Solana kind of lacked a meme, right? That was endemic to that network, like how Shiba Inu is native to Ethereum, and how Doge, even though it's not on Bitcoin, it's
related community overlap
with Bitcoin. And it's become apparent that BONK has kind of filled that role on Solana, and I think it's important to note that BONK, from how it was distributed, how it was created, it was airdropped to all of the very major developers across Solana. They've done some very, as you alluded to, very interesting things as it pertains to customer acquisition. They are airdropping to the Saga phone, and they sold out instantly. And so I think it's in some ways a silly meme, but in a lot of other ways, it's a very interesting way to leverage internet culture to acquire users and entice people to come and use the network. So
yeah, and some of those network effects to see played out next year. So we'll be staying tuned to see when Fundstrat's digital asset report comes out. When I know you guys are working on that hard over there, so we'll keep our eyes peeled in January. We'll have you back on the show. You were right last time, as you said, so we got to give you the props. Even if you were wrong, we'd have you back on anyways, because the research is that good. Sean Farrell from Fundstrat, I appreciate you coming back on, man. Thank you for taking the time. Have a great holiday if I don't see you or chat with you beforehand. But thank you again. We'll see you in January for the price calls that we can dig into.
Thanks, Zach. Looking forward to it.
Right on. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of our News Digest. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. As always, you can learn more at Coinage.media to participate in our Tourney to Crown Crypto Project of the Year. For Andre, for myself, for everybody else here at Coinage, thank you again for tuning in. We'll see you again soon. Have a great rest of your day.